If you have ever taken a closer look at how the rule of the octave occurs in actual pieces, you've probably noticed that long drawn-out passages, like the one you can see here, are actually pretty rare. More often than not, the rule of the octave pops up in short little chunks tied to shifting keys, like in this Beethoven passage. Here you can clearly see how different key areas are represented by short, contrasting snippets of the rule of the octave. Each new key is introduced with a dominant, basically a little rule of the octave module, in modern terms a secondary dominant and its resolution. You will also notice that these dominants tend to show up in all sorts of inversions. That's no coincidence. It's a neat way to keep the bass line moving stepwise, like right here at the beginning. Beethoven briefly detours into F major and the 4-2 chord resolves into the first inversion triad. It makes sense to think of this progression as a small slice of the descending rule of the octave, a little 4-3 move in the bass that implies specific progressions of the upper voices. And that, folks, is what today's video is all about. This is a chart with the most common voicings and voice leadings for the 4-3 progression. Personally, I really like these two because the outer voices form a nice counterpoint. Maybe you never thought about it this way, but the outer voices are crucial. I call this good counterpoint, not just because they move in contrary motion, but because the interval structure is really distinctive. It's a common move to put the augmented fourth in the outer voices in this type of dominant inversion. You see it all the time in actual compositions. For example, in this prelude by Kalkbrenner, which is basically 50% made up of this exact progression and voicing. Prelude's first section, Kalkbrenner lays this progression over a chromatic bass line and thus creates a sequence of successive dominant seventh chords resolving to first inversion major triads. Or from the rule of the octaves perspective, the bass provides an ongoing chain of local 4-3 progressions in major keys that are always a whole tone apart, and the chromatic bass line is a result of this. Now look at the outer voices and you'll see exactly what I described in the first place. The augmented fourth with the leading tone in the top voice resolving into the sixth. This kind of little prelude is actually a great exercise in improvisation or composition, and I highly recommend to put something like this together yourself. Here's a couple of my own attempts. The first one is a piece that is fully notated, and the second one on the same progression is an improvisation that I recorded a couple of years ago. I tried to go for some kind of Kalkbrenner style, or let's call this post-classical vibe, but unlike Kalkbrenner, I added a longer arpeggiated opening to establish the tonic. Then, for the sequence itself, I used two different patterns, one based on an arpeggio, the other one just on the chords, but both come back to that same outer voice setup with the augmented fourth. And now here is an improvised prelude on the same progression. It begins as well in B flat, but it'll modulate to and finish in E major. You probably noticed, this sequence suggests far modulations. If you want to really absorb these progressions, and by the way, want to learn a fancy chromatic sequence that surely would impress your clueless fellow students, I recommend the following 2 chord exercises. First, the one with the augmented fourth in the outer voices. And now the one with the leaping upper voice on the right. Alright, let's take a step back, because there's actually a few more chordal voicings on their progressions that I want to show you. These are what I think the most important ones. You should be able to find and play these quickly in all keys. The ones on the lower row, though, are especially important, because the dominant on the descending 4th degree can also show up as diminished 7th chord. Although these are in minor, the same progressions work perfectly in major key contexts, especially in classical and romantic music. Here is a tough but very effective exercise that demonstrates diminished 7th chords resolved into minor and major keys. These diminished 7th chords are all secondary dominants that temporarily tonicize closely related major and minor keys, drawn from the home scale of G major, laid out so that the bass line forms a smooth linear descent toward a cadence. The only key I skipped was B minor, but you could do the same exercise with all related keys or just a selection, that's up to you. And now I demonstrate a nice and little but clearly defined task on composition that I can recommend to everybody, which is to turn one of these progressions into a convincing motive. Okay, you probably know what the next step is. Link this motive into a chain of secondary dominants and round it off with a cadence. And then you have a little exercise. First the chords. And now with a motive applied. Compared to real composed music, this is obviously a little too schematic, too mechanical and kind of repetitive. But if you're working on leveling up your improv chops, this is an instructive model to copy. You can find 2 of these motive maps over on my Patreon page that you can use as inspiration for similar practice purposes. And for the next example, I'm gonna use one here that sounds a bit more classical and less romantic. because this one is mostly made of scales, you can clearly see how the use of a secondary dominant triggers a literal key shift. So it's not just a chordal phenomenon, but really affects all participating melodic parameters, and thus a local shift of key is as well a local shift of the scale you're ought to use. Okay, let's also do a minor key example. I'll take this building block, which shows more of a romantic flavor. This motive is drawn from a diminished 7th chord again, and there's a neat little detail here worth pointing out. It's this suspension in the inner voice, which adds an extra romantic touch. From the bass perspective, it's a 7/6 suspension. Nothing too wild if you're used to Baroque music actually. What I'm always asking myself is, how would you label this in terms of Roman numerals? Is this a 9th or what is it actually? Anyway, chords first. And now with the motive applied. This was a little bit mechanical so far, or this was more or less just exercises. So how do you take this kind of sequence of secondary dominants and use it in a more realistic or legitimate way? The purpose of secondary dominants is to provide harmonic activity. So a good place to make use of them would be the B section of a ternary form, because this is a typical situation where harmonic development is required. So I've prepared a little example for that as well. The A sections are nothing fancy, just a pedal point on C and a light dance-like melody. The B section, well, just take a look at all those accidentals and you'll know something's going on harmonically. There's a chromatic sequence. Let's see if we can figure out how it works. I'll break it down into its harmonic skeleton. The B section is basically a real sequence made from diminished 7th chords and major triads in first inversion, just like the stuff from earlier. But I wasn't thinking chord by chord, I had a broader architectural idea in mind. You could read the whole bass line as being in C major, moving chromatically down from the tonic to the subdominant, which then sets up the cadence. So when I'm doing this kind of chromatic stuff, I usually still take into account the scope of the home key. So when I hit D flat major, I still consider the bass note F as a diatonic member of the key of C major, which allows me to initiate the cadence towards the home key way easier. If you made it to this point of the video, I reckon you're still hungry for secondary dominance. If this is the case, I want to recommend another video that I produced a couple of weeks ago, which was on 7/1s. And the 7/1s are kind of the twin pair to the 4/3s and are as well suitable for chains of secondary dominance. Have fun. Thanks for watching.